First of all, let me address the elephant in the room straight away. So, there are no comments about asking about it. Yes, the Age of Calamity demo did come out in the week, and yes, I have played a lot of the game. However, I would like to let everyone else get their opinions onto YouTube before I voice my own opinion, especially since my video talking about these matters could in fact involve spoilers. So let's get into this video. 1 month ago and about a month ago before that, I've been speculating on certain aspects on the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So far, I have covered the dungeons and the enemies, and in the last video I said that I would do a video discussing the bosses that we could see in the next game. And while I did discuss mini-bosses in the sequel, I didn't elaborate at all on the main bosses. So today, let's do just that. But first of all, let's talk about some good and bad things that the bosses in Breath of the Wild did in my opinion. Well, you see, I am of the opinion that bosses in Breath of the Wild did some things amazingly and could have also been improved in many areas. First of all, let's begin with the good stuff. I think that most of us can agree that some of the Zelda series' older games had embarrassingly easy bosses. As I state almost weekly at this point, King Dodongo is a prime example of this, to the point where his Hyrule Warriors counterpart is actually somehow much harder to defeat. I don't even know how that works. Unfortunately, it isn't just King Dodongo who's had this issue in the past. Pretty much every boss before Breath of the Wild worked on a similar system. You find the boss's weak spot, once you somehow use the correct item on the boss's weak spot, you'll find the rest of the fight fairly easy. To use them as an example again, King Dodongo requires the Hero of Time to throw bombs into his mouth. Luckily, you first acquire a bomb bag in Dodongo Cavern, the dungeon where you face this beast, so it doesn't actually take long to figure this out. But as I've said, it's been a similar formula with pretty much every boss ever in the Zelda series. Instead of the same sort of system that we've seen time and time again, Breath of the Wild actually discovered that other games actually exist, and instead used a system much more akin to the likes of Dark Souls. Instead of having a specific item, it's about being able to recognise a pattern and knowing when an enemy is actually telegraphing an attack. Technically there is still a weakness, but I'll talk about that later on. The combat system itself plays to this sort of formula, as you can dodge attacks that have been telegraphed by a boss, and let her rip and doing a flurry rush just moments after. When you take an in-depth look at bosses, they really are some of the best in the series. Weirdly enough, the problems begin to arise when you look at the appearance of these bosses, the theming of some of these bosses, and one specific weakness that might be worse than some of the weaknesses seen in older games. So, let's begin with my issues with these bosses. First of all, the lack of differentiation between each boss. I won't discuss DLC bosses just yet, as I feel like that's a whole nother discussion, but out of the base bosses in game, all of these fights were just very similar. The only one that posed a danger to me on a first time through was probably Thunderblight Ganon, as I believe he's by far the hardest to this day. However, this could just be down to how much I scavenged materials on my first playthrough of Breath of the Wild. I was extremely thorough. The theming in general actually isn't too bad, truth be told. Attacks from each of the blights are fairly varied. The only thing that carries from boss to boss is the Guardian Laser that we came to see from every boss. Even Monk Mazcotia. As you'd expect, Fireblight Ganon uses many fire-based attacks. Warsblight Ganon carries a spear, much like Poseidon or Aquaman, and the fight takes place inside of a water-soaked section of Divine Beast Vah Ruta, meaning that the hero can use Cryonis if needed. Some of this boss's attacks actually require Link to use Cryonis or Stasis to break or otherwise redirect squares of ice that are hurled at Link by one of the puppets of Ganon. Windblight has cool theming alone and requires the player to use their glider at certain times, though most of their battle relies on the Guardian Lasers already mentioned. Thunderblight just uses some lightning based attacks that make the player use Magnesis to harm the Blight. So why do I think that the theming overall is still slightly poor? Well, I just didn't like the use of Guardian parts in every single boss fight. I grew tiresome over the idea in little to no time at all. The Guardian fights were cool themselves, but I didn't need all of the bosses to be centered around the same sort of idea. So then, I've talked about the base game's bosses, though I will talk about the final boss later on. But now let's quickly talk about Monk Mazcotia. In my opinion, he's flawed in some ways, but he's also extremely good. It's why he's probably my favourite Zelda boss in history. I think that this is mostly what I want from a boss in this series now. I need variety. This boss had 3 different phases. The first where he runs around as just a Sheik warrior trying to harm the Hero of Wilds. Then he spawns many different copies of himself, and this can do copious amounts of damage to Link. It's actually extremely hard to work your way out of this in the first time. Then the final phase kicks in, which is admittedly fairly easy and just requires you to use Magnesis on a metal ball. All of this culminates to possibly the hardest Zelda boss in history, and that's the sort of stuff that I'd personally like to see in the next game. some challenging bosses. My last issue with the base bosses is definitely the fact that they can all be taken down to the floor for the hero to wail on by just shooting them a couple times in the eye. It's partly why I think I like Thunderblight the most. It's much harder to shoot this boss in the eyes, as it's constantly moving, but all of the bosses are guilty of being way too easy if you just spam some arrows at them. Barring all of this stuff, the bosses in Breath of the Wild were amazing. Quickly talking about Calamity Ganon, his spider form was actually pretty damn nice. He had some really cool attacks and actually required you to parry at times. But again, it was just much like the other Guardian fights. And please do not get me started on Dark Beast Ganon, please. It was cool, it was a cool fight, but no, please. As I've heaped on enough praise to Munkmask Koshia, I may as well say that I hope bosses are more like him in the next game. So let's get into what I actually want from my boss in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Anyone who knows me probably knows that I love speculation, and this is an amazing topic to do that speculation on. So then, what would I like in Breath of the Wild 2 boss-wise? Well, let me tell you, I'm expecting nothing less than amazing combat to return. But this time, let's not give the bosses too many weaknesses. Let's at least not make it too easy to just shoot enemies in the head and just be done with it. I want the game to scale how hard the bosses are depending on where you are in the game. This is definitely doable, as it was done with the main enemies in Breath of the Wild. That's why all of the Bokoblins, Lizalfos, etc. seem to get harder and change colour over time. It'd be an ingenious way to make the bosses at least feel harder, even if they're not inherently tough or anything for smaller children. Next, I'd like what a lot of the Zelda fans are currently calling for. Way more appearance variety and perhaps even better theming. Imagine you walk into a mossy cave after making your way through a true competitor to the likes of the Forest Temple. You enter the lair of a demonic beast and something drops from above. A worn Gohma looks back at you. Over time it seems that the Gohma has evolved and their eyes become much smaller, meaning that it won't be a walk in the park seen in Ocarina of Time. No. Instead you must break off small bits of its armour around the Gohma's legs, much akin to Darknuts. But be careful, as it can jump backwards and swipe the hero if you're not found guarding yourself. After destroying all sections of armour around the Gohma's body, you finally enter the next phase of a battle. A true 1 versus 1 combat situation with a giant unarmoured arachnid. A beast sworn to brutalise their hero. As previously stated, the Gohma could slash at the hero, but Link could backflip and again, gain the ability to Flurry Rush, dealing massive amounts of damage to the beast. But be wary, as the Gohma can attack quickly and with ease. You must make up some ground so that Gohma doesn't destroy Link with one of its giant tusk-like claws. After so much damage, the Gohma can heal on the ceiling, but can be shot down with enough arrows, and Link can then climb onto the body of the colossal monster before setting the sword down to a glowing green area on its belly. I'm sorry, but I think that could easily be the best boss in the series, and with returning bosses we could even see some new, never before seen bosses. Just something so that not all bosses feel and play the exact same from dungeon to dungeon. Since I believe that even more combat options could come to the next game, this fight could easily be improved upon. In an ideal world, we got that fight in the first Breath of the Wild game. It blows my mind. So personally speaking, I want colossal beings that the hero can fight, to truly show the goddess Hylia that he deserves the Triforce of Courage, to show that he's the hero that has sworn to seal the darkness. I've always thought that giant bosses are much better, but can you even imagine just how cool it would be to ride on a giant earthworm through the caves of Hyrule? Bokoblins and Moblins rush towards the player as Link tries to find a weak spot on this gigantic foe. And with Breath of the Wild 2 seemingly taking a much darker approach than Breath of the Wild, all of this is very much feasible. The fact that the game seems to be darker to me signals that both enemies and bosses will be making a huge change. And I honestly hope so. For me, the bosses were one of the weakest and strongest aspects of Breath of the Wild. I can only hope that we can see a true follow-up to Breath of the Wild in many ways, and this is one of the main ones to me. Well then, it seems that we've gotten back to that time again. It always saddens me to see you all go. But I will be back next week, so why not subscribe if you're new to the channel, and like the video if you enjoyed. I've been on holiday this week, which is another reason why I couldn't do much discussing Age of Calamity just yet. But I'll definitely talk about it all in detail very soon. If you'd like to join all of these lovely people who already support me on Patreon right now, then why not go and check the link in the description for my Patreon, as you also get some benefits yourself. But please only pledge if you can and want to. All of my other social medias are in the description. My Twitter, Instagram and Twitch are all there. I hope you all had an amazing October, and most importantly, a great Halloween. And I'll be sure to get you another video next weekend. Please stay safe, and goodbye.